"Go find another table," her mother said at the family dinner. "This one is for real family." The words were spoken calmly, almost politely, but they landed like something far heavier in the center of the Whitmore dining room, where crystal glasses caught the chandelier light and silverware had been arranged with careful precision. Eleanor Whitmore, 67 years old, stood at the end of the long mahogany table she had polished with her own hands that afternoon, her fingers still faintly smelling of lemon oil, and for a brief second the room felt smaller, as if the walls had inched closer just to hear what she would do next. It was supposed to be a celebration, Margaret and Thomas Whitmore's 50th wedding anniversary, an evening of prime rib resting under silver covers, warm dinner rolls wrapped in linen, and a cake ordered from the bakery downtown that had served the family for decades. Every place card had been written in Margaret's careful script. Every chair had a name, except the seat Eleanor had assumed was hers. She noticed it only after her mother's voice cut through the soft hum of conversation. There was no card at the main table with Eleanor's name. Instead, near the bay window overlooking the backyard, a small round table had been set for one, like an afterthought, a quiet correction. For a moment, no one spoke. Her younger brother Daniel stared down at his plate. His wife adjusted her bracelet and offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Two grandchildren exchanged confused glances, sensing something had shifted but not understanding what. Margaret, elegant in a pale blue dress that matched the hydrangeas in the centerpiece, kept her chin lifted. "You understand," she added lightly. "Tonight is about blood." Eleanor felt the words settle in the air. Blood. She had heard it before, though never quite like this, never in front of the entire family, never framed as a boundary. She had been adopted at 3 months old. It had never been a secret. It had also never been an accusation, until now. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking seconds no one wanted to acknowledge. Eleanor's heartbeat slowed instead of racing. She smoothed the front of her navy dress, the one she'd bought for the occasion, pressed that morning until the seams lay flat and obedient. She thought about the years she had sat at that very table. Thanksgivings with 12 people squeezed elbow to elbow, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered across the hardwood floor, Sunday dinners where she refilled glasses before anyone asked. She had carved turkeys at that table. She had helped her father calculate property taxes at that table, penciling numbers onto yellow legal pads while he explained the difference between gross and net. She had signed birthday cards there and listened to her mother complain about grocery prices rising 20 cents a pound. But tonight, apparently, the definition of family had narrowed. Eleanor smiled. Not the brittle smile of embarrassment, not the shaky one that asks for rescue. It was small, controlled, almost serene. "Of course," she said evenly. She lifted her water glass, took a slow sip, and turned toward the small table by the window. The chair legs made a soft scrape against the hardwood as she pulled it back. Outside, the backyard lights glowed over the trimmed lawn and the oak tree her father had planted 35 years ago. She sat down alone, folded her napkin across her lap, and looked back toward the long table where laughter was cautiously restarting. If anyone expected her to protest, to ask for clarification, to remind them of decades spent as a daughter in that house, they would be disappointed. Eleanor Whitmore did not argue at dinner. She observed, and she remembered. The rest of the evening unfolded with a careful kind of politeness that felt more exhausting than anger ever could have been. From her small table by the bay window, Eleanor watched the rhythm of the main table resume in uneven waves. Silverware clinked against china. Someone complimented the seasoning on the roast. Daniel cleared his throat too often, filling silence that no one named. Margaret spoke brightly about the early years of her marriage, about first mortgages and station wagons, and the tiny apartment they had once shared that measured no more than 800 square feet. Each memory was presented like a polished heirloom, passed around for admiration. Eleanor listened without interrupting, though she had heard every one of those stories before, sometimes told while she stood at the stove stirring gravy, sometimes while she was the one washing dishes long after everyone else had gone home. She noticed how carefully her mother avoided looking toward the window. It was not cruelty delivered in raised voices. It was something quieter, more deliberate. When dessert was served, her niece Clara carried a slice of cake toward Eleanor with an apologetic half-smile. The frosting was thick and sweet, piped into careful rosettes that caught the light. I am sorry about earlier, Clara whispered, setting the plate down. Eleanor simply nodded. It is a beautiful cake, she said, and meant it. She took one measured bite. The sugar tasted the same as it always had. Across the room, Margaret lifted her champagne glass and proposed a toast to legacy. The word hung in the air almost as heavily as the earlier one. Legacy. Blood. The vocabulary of exclusion dressed up as tradition. Eleanor folded her napkin once, then again, aligning the corners precisely before resting it beside her plate. She remembered a different evening nearly 4 decades ago when her father had handed her the keys to her first car, a used sedan with 120,000 miles on it, and a radio that only worked when the weather was clear. Family takes care of family, he had said then, pressing the keys into her palm. No one had asked for proof of blood that night. No one had measured belonging by biology. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times. Guests began gathering coats from the hallway closet. Goodbyes were exchanged with gentle embraces and promises to meet again soon. Eleanor stood, smoothing her dress once more, and walked toward the kitchen where platters were being stacked near the sink. She lifted one without being asked. Margaret paused beside her. For a second, the room quieted again, as if waiting for another correction. Instead, Margaret adjusted a serving spoon and said in a neutral tone, "You handled that well." It was not an apology. It was an assessment. Eleanor met her mother's reflection in the darkened kitchen window. "I always do," she replied softly. Then she carried the platter to the counter, set it down with steady hands, and allowed herself one long, silent look at the table where she had once believed she would always have a seat. When the last guest left and the front door closed with a muted click, the house seemed to exhale. The chandelier in the dining room still glowed overhead, casting soft light across the long mahogany table where half-empty glasses and folded napkins remained like quiet witnesses. Eleanor moved through the room without hurry. She gathered plates one by one, stacking them carefully, aligning the edges as if order itself were a kind of dignity. In the kitchen, warm water filled the sink, and steam rose in thin ribbons toward the ceiling. Daniel lingered in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "She did not mean it the way it sounded," he said finally, staring at the tile floor instead of at her. Eleanor rinsed a plate, watching the frosting dissolve under the stream of water. "It sounded exactly the way it was meant," she replied, her tone even, almost thoughtful. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. After a moment, he retreated down the hallway, leaving the faint scent of his cologne behind. The clock read 9:30. The anniversary banner still hung across the fireplace mantel, its gold lettering slightly crooked now that the tape had loosened. Eleanor dried her hands and walked back into the dining room. She paused beside the main table, running her fingertips along the polished surface where her place card should have been. There was a small indentation in the wood near the head of the table, a mark from years ago when she had accidentally set down a hot dish without a trivet. Her father had laughed about it then and called it character. "Every table tells a story," he had said. She wondered what story this one would tell now. From the hallway, she heard Margaret's measured footsteps. "You could have made a scene," her mother said, stopping a few feet away. "You chose not to." It was not gratitude. It was evaluation. Eleanor turned slowly. "I have never needed a scene to make a point," she answered. Margaret studied her for a long second, her expression unreadable, then nodded once and continued upstairs. The house grew quiet after that. Outside, the backyard lights clicked off automatically at 10 o'clock, leaving only the pale glow of the street lamp filtering through the window. Eleanor walked to the small round table where she had sat alone. Her empty plate was still there, the fork placed neatly across the rim. She lifted the place card that had been set at that table. It bore no name, only a decorative flourish in gold ink. No identity, no claim. She slipped it into her purse without thinking, as if preserving evidence. In the silence of the nearly empty room, one realization settled clearly in her mind. Being adopted had never defined her place in that house. But someone had decided to redefine it tonight. And Eleanor, who had spent a lifetime observing more than she spoke, understood that when definitions change, so do outcomes. The house was quiet long after midnight, but Eleanor did not go upstairs. She sat alone in the living room with only the lamp beside her illuminated, its soft yellow light pooling over the worn arm of the leather chair her father had favored for decades. The place card from the small table rested on the coffee table in front of her, its blank surface catching the light in a way that felt almost deliberate. No name, no designation, just gold trim around an empty center. She thought about the first day she had been brought into that house 64 years ago, wrapped in a white blanket that her mother had once described as delicate and expensive. There had been photographs taken on the front steps. Neighbors had stopped by with casseroles. Her father had stood taller that day, proud in a way that could not be measured in inches or dollars. "This is our daughter," he had said, without hesitation, without footnotes. Eleanor had grown up believing that sentence was permanent. Now she replayed moments from the past that she had once dismissed as small misunderstandings. The heirloom ring passed from Margaret to Daniel's wife. The family photo rearranged so that she stood slightly off-center. The way legal documents were discussed in low tones when she entered the room. She had told herself it was nothing. She had chosen gratitude over suspicion, loyalty over doubt. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, each second crisp in the stillness. Around 1 in the morning, Eleanor rose and walked toward her father's old study. The door creaked softly as she pushed it open. The shelves were lined with leather-bound books and file boxes labeled in his precise handwriting. She had not entered this room often since his passing 3 years ago. The air smelled faintly of paper and cedar. She moved toward the filing cabinet near the window, running her fingers along the metal handle before pulling it open. Inside were folders organized by year, property records, insurance policies, tax statements calculated down to the last cent. Her father had been a meticulous man. She remembered how he used to sit at this very desk every April, explaining deductions and exemptions in patient detail while she poured him coffee measured exactly to 8 ounces. "Everything is documented," he would say. "Clarity prevents conflict." Eleanor knelt and began scanning the labels, her breathing slow and deliberate. Had been established in her name on the day she turned 42. It outlined specific assets, including a portion of the property, a modest investment account, and rights that could not be altered without her written consent. The terms were clear. The trustee had been listed as an independent attorney, not Margaret. Eleanor exhaled slowly. She remembered that birthday now. Her father had given her a fountain pen, telling her that adulthood was not only about age but about understanding one's position in the world. At the time, she had assumed the gift was symbolic. Now she understood it had been something more. There was also a letter attached, folded carefully between the pages. It was addressed to her in her father's steady handwriting. She unfolded it with care. He wrote about foresight, about ensuring fairness, about protecting what he called her rightful place. He did not mention blood. He mentioned commitment. He mentioned years shared under one roof, decisions made together, sacrifices witnessed. "Family is built," he had written, "and what is built deserves protection." Eleanor rested her hands flat on the desk. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The previous evening's words echoed faintly in her memory, but they no longer carried the same weight. Definitions spoken in passing could shift the air in a room. Definitions written and notarized could shift something far more lasting. Around 9 o'clock, her phone buzzed softly on the desk. A message from Clara appeared on the screen. It read simply, "Are you okay?" Eleanor looked at the oak tree again, its branches steady in the morning light. She typed back, "I am exactly where I need to be." Then she closed the folder, placed it neatly on the desk, and understood that what had been questioned at dinner had already been answered years ago in ink that would not fade. By late morning, Eleanor had placed the trust documents back into their folder, but she did not return them to the cabinet. Instead, she set them neatly inside her leather briefcase, the same one she had carried for years when volunteering at the local community center. The house felt different now, not hostile, not wounded, but clarified. She moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, wiping down counters that were already clean, aligning the salt and pepper shakers so they faced the same direction. Precision had always calmed her. Around 10:30, she picked up the telephone and dialed the number printed on the letterhead of the law office listed in the trust agreement. The receptionist answered in a measured tone, and Eleanor asked to speak with the trustee named in the document, Mr. Harold Benton. There was a brief pause, the sound of keys tapping in the background, and then a transfer click. A steady male voice greeted her. She introduced herself fully, stating her name clearly, her birth date, and the year the trust had been established. There was recognition on the other end. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Your father was very thorough." Eleanor almost smiled at that. "I would like to confirm the current standing of the agreement," she replied. Her tone remained composed, neither defensive nor confrontational. Papers rustled softly through the receiver. Mr. Benton explained that the trust remained intact, unchanged, and legally binding. The assets listed were secure, and no amendments had been filed. The provisions required her consent for any alteration. Margaret's name was not attached in any controlling capacity. Eleanor listened without interrupting, absorbing each word like careful notes in the margin of a ledger. When the call ended, she thanked him and placed the receiver back in its cradle with deliberate care. The kitchen clock read 11:15. Upstairs, she heard the faint sound of a drawer opening, then closing. Margaret was awake. Eleanor poured herself another cup of coffee, measuring the cream precisely, and carried it to the dining room. The long mahogany table still stood as it always had, polished and imposing. She ran her hand along its edge, feeling the smooth grain beneath her fingertips. The events of the previous night no longer felt like a wound. They felt like a revelation. The power of exclusion had relied on uncertainty, on the assumption that she had no foundation beyond sentiment. Now she understood that sentiment had never been her only anchor. Footsteps approached from the staircase. Margaret entered the room wearing a tailored cardigan, her posture upright. Her gaze flicked briefly toward the briefcase resting on the sideboard. "You are up early," she observed. Eleanor met her eyes steadily. "I had a few things to review," she replied. The statement was simple, factual. Margaret studied her for a moment longer, perhaps expecting emotion, perhaps expecting confrontation. Instead, she found composure, the kind that does not raise its voice because it does not need to. And for the first time since the dinner, the balance in the room had shifted, not through argument, but through knowledge quietly confirmed. That afternoon, Eleanor did something she had not done in years. She set the dining room table for four. Not for a celebration, not for a holiday, just for a conversation. She chose simple white plates, water glasses filled halfway, and cloth napkins folded into clean rectangles. No banner, no flowers. The room looked balanced, almost neutral. Around 5 o'clock, Daniel arrived first, his expression cautious, as if stepping into weather he could not quite predict. Clara followed behind him, offering Eleanor a quiet hug that lingered a second longer than usual. Margaret entered last, her posture composed, her gaze sweeping the room as if assessing changes. Eleanor gestured toward the chairs. "Please sit," she said calmly. There was no tremor in her voice, no edge, just invitation. They took their places at the long mahogany table. Eleanor remained standing for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the back of her chair. Then she placed her leather briefcase on the table and opened it with deliberate care. The sound of the latch clicking open seemed louder than it should have been. She removed a neatly organized folder and set it in the center. "I reviewed something this morning," she began evenly. Daniel shifted in his seat. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, not in fear, but in calculation. Eleanor opened the folder and turned it so that the documents faced outward. The trust agreement lay there in black and white, official seals visible in the corner. "Father established this 25 years ago," she said. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply stated facts. "It outlines assets and rights that were placed in my name. They cannot be altered without my written consent." Silence filled the room, heavier than it had been at the anniversary dinner. Daniel leaned forward, scanning the page. Clara's eyes moved quickly across the legal language. Margaret remained still. "This is unnecessary," Margaret said at last, her tone controlled. Eleanor met her gaze. "Clarity is never unnecessary," she replied. "You taught me that." The words were not sharp. They were precise. She reached into the folder again and removed the letter. Her father had written. She did not read it aloud. She simply placed it beside the agreement. "He anticipated questions," she said softly. "He answered them before they were ever spoken." Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound almost a release. Clara looked between them, understanding dawning without drama. Margaret's composure did not break, but something in her posture shifted, a fraction less certain. Eleanor finally sat down, folding her hands neatly on the table. "I do not need a different chair," she said, her voice steady. "I have always had my place." The statement did not demand apology. It did not seek validation. It simply corrected the narrative that had been introduced the night before. Outside, the oak tree stood unmoved in the fading light. Inside, the definition of family no longer hovered in the air as something negotiable. It lay documented, signed, and confirmed. And this time, no one suggested she find another table. No one spoke for several seconds after Eleanor's words settled over the table. The air did not feel tense anymore. It felt measured. Daniel cleared his throat quietly, then leaned back in his chair as if recalibrating something inside himself. Clara reached for the trust agreement again, scanning the final page where the signature and notary seal confirmed what had already been stated. Margaret's hands remained folded on the table, her posture upright, her expression composed in the way it had always been when control was slipping but not yet gone. "Your father did not consult me about this," she said finally, her voice level but edged with restrained disbelief. Eleanor did not respond immediately. She allowed the statement to exist without interruption. Then she answered, "He did not need to." There was no accusation in her tone, only fact. The oak tree outside cast long shadows across the yard as evening approached, the light filtering through its branches in steady patterns. Inside, the mahogany table no longer felt like a boundary. It felt like evidence. Daniel looked at his mother, then at Eleanor. "Why was this never discussed?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Because it was never questioned," she replied. "Until now." The distinction was subtle, but it landed. Clara placed her hand gently on the table between them, not in defense of anyone, but in acknowledgement of what had shifted. Margaret's composure held, but her eyes moved. Once toward the folder, then back to Eleanor. "You could have brought this up years ago," she said. Eleanor nodded slightly. "I never needed to." The simplicity of the answer left little room for argument. The previous evening's implication had relied on silence as weakness. Today, silence had become strength. Eleanor closed the folder carefully and slid it back into her briefcase. The gesture was unhurried, deliberate. "I am not here to challenge anyone," she said. "I am here to clarify my position." The words were calm, but they carried weight. Daniel exhaled again, longer this time, as if tension he had carried without noticing had begun to dissolve. Margaret rose slowly from her chair, smoothing her cardigan with controlled movements. For a moment, she seemed prepared to speak further. Instead, she adjusted the centerpiece slightly to the left, aligning it with the center of the table. The gesture felt familiar, almost symbolic. Order restored, but not in the way she had intended. Eleanor stood as well, meeting her mother's eyes without hesitation. There was no hostility there, only certainty. "I will always respect this family," she said quietly. "But respect does not require surrender." Margaret held her gaze for a long second before turning toward the hallway. The conversation had not been loud. It had not been dramatic. Yet the balance in the room had shifted permanently. Eleanor remained by the table after the others stepped away, resting her hand lightly on its polished surface. She did not need to claim a seat. She did not need to defend her existence. Her place had never depended on approval. It had depended on documentation, on intention, and on years that could not be erased by a single sentence spoken over dinner. Outside, the evening settled evenly across the yard, steady and unbothered. Inside, so did she. The house settled into a new quiet that evening, not the strained silence of avoidance, but the steady calm that follows clarity. Eleanor remained in the dining room long after the others had retreated to separate corners of the house. She moved the chairs back into perfect alignment, each one positioned evenly beneath the table as it had been for decades. The mahogany surface reflected the overhead light without distortion, smooth and unbroken. For years, she had believed that belonging required constant proof, small gestures of loyalty, quiet compliance. Now she understood that belonging, when genuine, did not demand performance. It simply existed. The following morning, she prepared breakfast as she always had, measuring the oatmeal carefully, slicing fruit into even portions. Daniel joined her at the kitchen island, his movements slower than usual. He looked older somehow, not in years, but in awareness. "I never questioned it," he admitted quietly, staring into his coffee mug. Eleanor stirred her tea, watching the steam rise. Most people do not question what feels comfortable, she replied. There was no bitterness in her tone, only observation. Clara stopped by before work, offering a brief embrace that felt sincere, not obligated. Margaret remained upstairs longer than usual. When she finally descended, she paused at the edge of the kitchen, her gaze resting on Eleanor with something unfamiliar behind it. Not anger, not apology, recognition. Your father trusted you, she said, her voice lower than before. Eleanor met her eyes calmly. He did. Nothing more needed to be added. Later that afternoon, Eleanor walked into the backyard and stood beneath the oak tree. Its trunk was thick now, its bark textured by time. She placed her hand against it, feeling the solidity beneath her palm. The tree had been planted with intention, nurtured through seasons, strengthened by years of steady growth. No one questioned its place in the yard because it had always been there. She realized then that her position in this family had been much the same, built through decades of presence, responsibility, and quiet contribution. The previous week's comment had attempted to reduce her identity to a technicality. But identity shaped by time and commitment cannot be undone by a single remark. That evening, as the family gathered again in the living room, there was no discussion of blood or legacy. Conversation returned to ordinary topics. Property taxes increasing by a small percentage, the cost of groceries rising by a few dollars, Clara's upcoming work project. Eleanor sat in her usual chair without invitation and without resistance. No one suggested another seat. The balance had been restored not through confrontation, but through confirmation. As the sun set beyond the oak tree, casting long shadows across the lawn, Eleanor understood something with quiet certainty. Family is not defined by who is allowed at the table. It is defined by who remains steady when definitions are tested. And she had remained steady. That was her answer. That was her place.